He found her on the rain-bright steps outside the courthouse, sari hem dark with water and mascara threaded like ink on her cheeks. Taxis hissed by, the world kept moving as if hearts and promises weren't breaking in the doorway behind her. When he reached out, she didn't flinch, just stared at his open hand as if it were a bridge over night itself. "Amna," he said, steady, certain, as thunder rolled somewhere over the city. She swallowed, the smallest nod trembling in her throat, and whispered the words that would anchor everything that followed, yours, or no one. Amna's life was a delicate choreography of duty. Morning started before dawn in a house that hummed with old expectations, tea set steaming by the window, ironed uniforms stacked like thin towers, her mother's medicine lined up in a tin box with the dates written neatly in blue pen. After the accident 2 years ago took her father's easy whistle and left the family with hospital bills and silence, she had become the hinge on which everything swung. She taught English at a neighborhood school where the chalk dust got into her nails and the children drew suns with too many rays. In the evenings, she tutored 2 teenage sisters whose mother paid in mangoes and gratitude. When she had thoughts for herself, they were brief and soft and guilty. Hamza met her on a Sunday that smelled like cardamom and rain. He was late to a volunteer reading circle at the school, breathless, shirt clinging, hair failing to obey. He could fix a projector with a paperclip and a prayer, he could make 10-year-olds sit up straighter with a single story about a spaceship that ran on kindness. He had a laugh like the first crack in a storm cloud and an engineer's way of looking at a problem and seeing hidden doors. The principal introduced them. "Miss Amna runs the ship around here. Hamza claims he can build another one." When their eyes met, something inside both of them recognized a language they'd never been taught. They discovered they both loved the same bookstore with peeling paint and a cat that slept on the poetry shelf. They learned each other's coffees, hers sweet enough to erase worry for 5 minutes, his strong enough to keep promises awake. He took her to the rooftop of his office building after hours, where the city hummed below like a crowded orchestra. She told him how her father used to measure time by the ASIN and the cricket scores. He told her about the scholarship that had pulled him out of a neighborhood that didn't forgive easy successes. They laughed too loudly and then looked around to see if anyone was allowed to be that happy. The first trouble arrived not like thunder but like a cough you ignore until you can't. Amna's mother's health dipped, one of those slow descents that steals sleep from everyone in the house. At the same time, the school lost funding for a program she'd built from scratch. She stretched herself thinner and thinner until she wore the day like a transparent scarf. Hamza learned to be gentle with his suggestions and relentless with his presence. He brought soup in flasks that actually kept it hot, he fixed the loose hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had squealed for months, he befriended the neighborhood pharmacist so the right medicines were never out of stock when the price went up. Their happiness, though honest, tugged against old ropes. Amna's aunt began to bring suitable matches, in the form of photographs and resumes. Men with family businesses, men with apartments already furnished, men whose mothers called Amna a sensible girl with a tone that meant pliable. One evening, while her mother dozed in the next room, the aunt laid out the cards plain: "Your duty is to your family, Beta. Hamza is a good boy, but can good boys pay for good hospitals? Can a love story guarantee a roof if rain comes sideways?" The questions lodged like pebbles in Amna's shoes. She could keep walking, but not without feeling them. Hamza, for his part, was offered a promotion that meant late nights for months and a transfer afterwards to a city an hour's flight away. "It's what I've worked for," he said in a voice that wanted permission. It could change everything. Everything, Amna knew, sometimes meant more money but fewer dinners together, more security, less of the simple human presence that had been keeping her steady. She didn't want to be the woman who asked him to fold his bright future small enough to fit inside a kitchen drawer. She also didn't want to be the woman who watched him go and told herself it was noble. One Saturday, holding plastic bags of vegetables that already smelled like Monday, Amna and Hamza stopped outside the bookstore and stood in front of the shutter pulled down for renovation, a sign flapping, "Back soon." "Stories can't keep quiet for long," he said, "we need to talk." She felt relief, talk was a bridge too. They sat on the curb, a city of ankles and tires moving past them, the rain coming in hesitant drops. "I don't want to be the reason you choose less," she said, eyes on the crosswalk's blinking hand. "And I don't want to become a story about how we almost had it." He said her name like a prayer. "Then let's not be almost. Let's be stubborn. Let's make a plan that offends everyone who says love is impractical." He pulled a notebook from his bag, the same one where he sketched circuits and annotated dreams, and on one page he wrote, "Us, 12 months." He drew a grid, time on one axis, money on the other, boxes for mother's treatment, rent, savings, 2 non-negotiable evenings a week together, 1 small trip in 6 months even if it's just to the next town, honesty, when fear comes. It wasn't romantic in the way movies taught, it was romantic in the way that keeps the lights on. For a while, they became architects of realistic hope. Hamza took the promotion but negotiated to delay the transfer for 6 months. He killed himself on work during the day and killed himself being present at night, and somehow lived both. Amna accepted a side project editing educational materials that paid more than it should have. She learned to say no to the aunt's invitations without breaking either woman. Her mother, cautious as a cat, began to look at Hamza with something like trust. When he learned how to make the exact cardamom tea her father used to brew and brought it to the living room in the cup with a small chip on the rim, the old woman smiled and, though her gaze was stern, it lingered like warmth on him. Then the second trouble didn't knock at all. It burst the door. Amna's father's old business partner appeared with a folded sheaf of papers and a face arranged into sympathy. "Your late father's small loan," he said, clicking his tongue, "was never formally cleared." The interest, like ivy, had crawled everywhere. The sum, while not ruinous, was heavy enough to tip all their careful balances. The partner offered a solution in a voice polished by years: "I know a family. Very respectable. Their son has adored Amna from afar. They are prepared to help with the debt. Consider it, joining hands." The word "joining" sounded like a ribbon tied too tight. That night, while their neighborhood slept and the ceiling fan ticked like a lazy metronome, Amna stared at the notebook where "Us, 12 months" had acquired checkmarks and coffee stains. "What if," she asked the empty room, "the brave thing isn't possible?" Hamza's messages pinged through: "Don't make decisions in the darkest hour. I'm coming over early, I'll cook breakfast, the terrible omelet you pretend to like." She smiled despite herself and then cried in a way the house had not heard in 2 years, quietly, into her sleeve, so no one would wake and ask her to be sensible. The next day at dawn, she stood at the balcony and watched a boy fly a kite from the rooftop opposite. The kite dipped, tangled, failed to obey the prettiest wind. The boy didn't scold it. He reeled it in, fingers sure, and tried again. She realized, with a suddenness that hurt, that love was both the string and the sky, and nothing in between was guaranteed. The courthouse stairs learned their story before their friends did. There had to be a legal place to sign papers and there had to be a roof where people looked at each other and said, "Are you sure?" without speaking. Amna's mother, Freilia that week, had said, "If you must, Beta, do it properly," which in their language meant a small ceremony later, at home, after the dust settled. But Amna, practical as ever, went to the courthouse first to ask about the loan documents, to see if the partners' numbers made sense, to search for mercy written in small print. Inside, the daylight was bored and the floor smelled like old water. She waited on a bench worn down by other people's choices. The clerk squinted at her papers, then found another folder, then shook his head with a regret that was, at least, human. The interest had grown teeth. The hours grew heavy, and when she came outside, the sky had decided to prove it could split itself open without warning. Hamza arrived at the run to find her there, a single figure holding all the weather. He didn't ask questions at first. He simply stepped into the rain until he was as soaked as she was, and then he held out his hand. It was absurd that this changed anything, and also the precise reason everything changed. She took it. "Yours," she said, voice breaking on the rock of fear, "or no one." He nodded once, like a man signing up for a long war he believed he could win. Okay, he said. Then I'm yours. No one has to be brave alone. The days after that sentence were not cinematic. They were lists and phone calls, calculations in pencil, calendars rearranged like furniture. Hamza contacted a legal aid clinic he'd once spoken to at a community event. He sat across from a lawyer, kind eyes, earnest ties, and learned that the partner's paperwork was not as ironclad as he'd implied. There were options. None were easy, some were fair. They could negotiate a settlement, pay in trenches, bite the sum smaller. It meant postponing the whispered plans for a formal wedding in the big hall. It meant telling their families that practicality sometimes wore ordinary clothes. Amna told her aunt, who took the news like a woman discovering her watch was fast. You are throwing away a golden lifeline, the aunt said, and there was pain in it because she believed it. Amna listened, hands steady on the back of the chair, and then said gently, a lifeline tied to my throat is a leash. Her aunt's face softened in ways she didn't expect. You have your mother's stubborn mouth, she said, which was, this time, a kind of blessing. Hamza's mother, who had loved her son fiercely and protected him from both poverty and excess, asked sharp questions. If love is a house, she said, who builds the fourth wall? He answered without drama, we do. Together. It may be crooked at first. She stared, then sighed, and then, in the kitchen, handed Amna the spice box and said, you know which lid hides the cumin? It was an initiation. Amna opened the right one with a hand that didn't shake. They began paying the debt in monthly portions that felt like a stone moved daily by inches. Hamza reworked his budget with an engineer's ruthlessness. He let go of the shiny phone upgrade and a trip he'd been planning with college friends. Amna added a weekend class for adult learners, a new kind of exhaustion that paid in crisp notes and small, grateful smiles. Sometimes they were too tired to talk, so they sat side by side on her balcony and let their shoulders lean until the world remembered how to be possible. Yet love isn't a spreadsheet, and fear has a way of knocking twice. The transfer date loomed like a cloud on the calendar. Hamza's company reminded him via polite emails and impersonal scheduling software that he was expected in the new office by the first Monday in July. The distance wasn't forever, but distance has its own gravity. They did the math of time zones and flight costs. They told themselves stories of couples who had made it through. Then, the week before he was due to go, something that looked like a miracle arrived in his inbox. A local nonprofit offered him a role directing a small engineering program for public schools, less pay than the big company, fewer plaudits, a different kind of glory. The subject line was simple, come build with us. Hamza's chest learned a new ache, the ache of choosing between the life he had planned and the life that suddenly looked like him. He brought the offer to Amna the way a child brings a found treasure, eyes unsure. If I take this, the debt will take longer, he said. If I don't, I'll be far. And we'll be brave, but we'll be tired. She didn't answer with the speech he feared or the permission he wanted. Instead, she took the notebook, Us, 12 months, and turned to a blank page. Us, real life, she wrote at the top. Underneath, 2 questions, what feeds us? What costs too much? They spent the night there, at that table where the varnish was wearing thin, answering with honesty that tasted like medicine. What feeds us, being in the same city when my mother gets fevers at 2 a.m., walking to the market together on Fridays, work that doesn't make us strangers to ourselves. What costs too much, losing years to a ladder that doesn't lean against a wall we care about, paying a debt fast but starving the parts of us that can't be fed later. In the morning, with the city clear-washed and the tea properly sweet, Hamza wrote his answer to the nonprofit. He would come build with them. The world, of course, did not applaud. Some colleagues called it naive. His manager sent a message with 3 sentences and no punctuation. A friend from university said, "You'll regret it when you're 40." But when Hamza visited a public school and watched a girl hold a 3D, printed gear like a star, he felt for the first time that his days clicked into place. At night, tired in a way that honored his body, he walked to Amna's place with leftovers and they ate on the floor, knees touching, like students again. The debt, stubborn as ever, shrank not because they were rich but because they were consistent. The partner, a man who had expected them to fold, eventually stopped arriving with papers and pinched expressions. He met them once in a coffee shop near the courthouse and, after a long pause, said, "Your father was a decent man. He would have liked that you are, too." It wasn't absolution, it was a strange, sideways peace. When they finally had the formal ceremony, it was at home just as her mother had wanted. The formal ceremony, it was at home just as her mother had wanted. The living room was strung with marigolds and faulty fairy lights that decided to work at the last possible second. Hamza's mother cried the way mothers cry when grief and joy braid themselves together. The aunt stood by the tea table and asked the DJ, someone's cousin, to lower the volume because love, she decided, should be heard in conversation. Friends jammed onto the staircase, passing plates and laughter. Amna wore a sari the color of the first sunrise of June. Hamza wore a sherwani that made him look briefly like a prince who had sold his palace to fund a school. In the middle of the celebration, the neighborhood kids barged in with a crooked handmade banner that read, in letters barely tamed by glue, "Miss Amna and Sir Hamza, we knew it." When the last guests left and the last plate was washed, they stood by the balcony doors and watched the city twinkle like a brave constellation. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "what our life would have been if you hadn't taken my hand that day?" She thought of the courthouse steps, of rain stitching the air together, of the way her palm had found his as if they had been practicing for years. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember that fear would have come regardless. At least this way, we trained it to sit at the door and not run the house." Months later, when Amna's mother had a night of fever that scared them more than they admitted, Hamza slept in a plastic chair by her bed, snoring with his head tipped back, one hand open on his knee like a question mark turned into a cradle. The old woman woke at dawn, looked at him, and whispered to Amna, "That one, he doesn't run from the hard hours." Amna smiled. "Neither do we," she said, and meant both of them. The school where Amna worked gained a new room, the Maker's Corner. A place Hamza helped build where children learned to turn ideas into objects, to take a curved problem and straighten it with persistence. On its door hung a small sign painted by the kids, "Hands that build, hearts that hold." On Fridays, Amna stood by that door after dismissal and watched a stream of small lives carrying gears and cardboard bridges and a new sense that the world could be coaxed. She thought, not for the first time, that love had taught her the same thing. They did not become rich in the way that looks shiny on screens, but they did stock their pantry with laughter, their calendar with evenings that mattered, their hallway with shoes belonging to friends who came too often to be called guests. There were arguments, the small, ordinary kind about laundry and schedules and how long too long is to scroll at night, and there were apologies, which they learned to make before pride could harden. There were setbacks, there were small, rogue joys. A perfect mango, a bill lower than expected, a bus that arrived on time. One rain-glossed evening, on the exact steps where their story had re-begun. They returned, not by plan but because the cafe nearby was full and the city was theirs to walk. The courthouse doors were closed, the stairs were empty. Hamza took her hand again, not because she was trembling now, but because the gesture had become their grammar. "If you had to do it over," he asked, "would you still choose me?" She didn't answer with poetry. She answered with truth. "Every time," she said, and then, for the few people on the sidewalk whose lives might, just might, be listening, she added, "Yours or no one." The camera of life, the one that belongs to every onlooker who loves a story, could have cut there. But if it lingered a moment longer, it would have captured their hands, weathered by ordinary heroics, linked not against the world but for it. It would have seen two people who learned that courage is not a sprint but a habit, that love is not a rescue but a daily decision, and that sometimes the most radical vow you can make is to keep showing up. Wet steps, hard hours, everything, in the name of a future you build with your own, stubborn, open hands. And that is the message their story leaves behind for anyone still watching at the end. When fear comes dressed as practicality and tells you to settle for almost, look for the hand that reaches back through the rain. If you can take it, take it. If you can offer it, offer it. Then build the kind of life where yours or no one doesn't sound like a cliff, but like a door you both learn to keep open.